Now that we've completed our front and back draft in size 4 and we have our sleeve to match, what we're going to do is we're going to cut all of these out in muslin fabric. And then we're going to sew these up and do a test fit back to our dress form. For the sleeve draft here, we've already added all of our seam allowance and we have our notches. Everything's ready to go. What we need to do is we need to put in the correct seam allowance here on our bodices and make sure our notches are clear and easy to see. Let's start here with the front bodice piece. So take out your pencil, your clear ruler, and some magic tape. What we'll do is we'll start here up at the shoulder of the front bodice. What we want to do is we're going to trim this down to be 1/2 inch seam allowance. And if you remember, we already have this shoulder notch on here. Let's go ahead and extend that all the way through the seam allowance, making sure that you are square with the shoulder level. And then let's go ahead and cut away the extra paper. Now along the neck, we have where we've clipped the seam allowances. What I want to do is I just want to tape that back so it stays flat and clean. And just be careful when you're taping it, you don't accidentally crease some of these clips, or else it's going to make your pattern piece bend as if though there was a dart there. We're going to go ahead and stay with the 1/2 inch seam allowance at the neck. Normally when you sew a neck, you only want the 1/4 inch seam allowance, but we'll leave all this paper here just in case we need to make an adjustment later. All along center front, everything is finished. Coming down here into the waist area, look for some spots where you might have clipped a little bit too far and you might want to tape that up. Basically, we're going to add 1/2 inch seam allowance to this. So I just see a couple spots on mine where I want to make sure I get a nice clean 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now before we cut this out, what we need to do is we have to fold the dart. So remember, starting from center front, you come out to the first dart leg, fold that dart leg, crease your pattern piece here at the dart tip, and then we can close the dart leg going towards the side seam. Let's tape that so it does not move. And then we'll come in here and we'll add our 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure that when you start here at the center front that your ruler is square, and then you start following the curve of the waist. And then as we get over here to the side seam, we want to make sure we're square with the side seam. And you always want to cut your seam allowance away while the dart is closed. And now when you take the dart out, you can see the shaping for the dart, and you need to cut this shaping out when you're cutting this in muslin fabric. And these dart legs are notches, so go ahead and make sure that they're nice and dark all the way through the seam allowance. Come back up here to the dart tip and circle it, just to make sure you know exactly where that dart tip is. Let's continue on over here to the side seam. The side seam is just a straight line. And I'm noticing here where my HBL goes all the way through the pattern piece and out into the seam allowance. I'm going to just erase this in the seam allowance area so we don't confuse it as to be in a notch. And we do have our notch here where it says SS for side seam. And then the last one here, we want to get this armhole. Again, let's tape down some spots. If it's cutting inside that 1/2 inch seam allowance area. And remember, when you're drawing the seam allowance for the armhole, the very first part of the armhole here is square with the side seam. And then you will start following the curve for the armhole shaping. Now as I get here to the notch, I can see my notch inside the clear ruler, and I have the notch at the center of my ruler. And again, I'm checking the curve, so the distance from here to the curve and the distance from here to the curve are the same. So I know that this notch is square in this area. I could put a mark out here and I can square that off. And then I'll continue drawing my seam allowance. Now on mine, I just cut off 8 14/16. I'm going to come and put that down here just for reference for later if I need that. If there's any other lines that are going into the armhole, you'll want to erase those now. And if there's some lines that are underneath tape so you can't erase them, just put a light squiggle on those so we know that those are not notches. And this is your notch right here. Same thing up in the shoulder. I have a bunch of tape on this, so I'm going to just do a little squiggle there. I'll leave my circle with the dot. Alright, so the front looks good. Now basically I'm going to do the same thing here for the back. I'm going to have 1/2 inch all the way around. When I pass by the waist dart, I need to fold the dart and cut the 1/2 inch. And when I pass by the shoulder dart, I need to fold the shoulder dart and cut it off. So I folded the back dart, added 1/2 inch seam allowance to the waist. And now when I take the dart out, I can see the shaping for the dart. And then we want to come in here and make sure the dart legs are nice and dark. If there's any other extra lines on here, go ahead and squiggle them out or erase them so they don't look like notches. I'll put the center of my ruler at the first notch. Here I'm making sure that the curve distance here to here and here to here inside the ruler is the same. And then I know I can square out that first notch, and I'll move down to the second notch, do the same thing. And this double notch, the two lines are 1/4 of an inch apart. And then I can finish getting the rest of my seam allowance and cut this out. Make sure as you come over here to the edge of the side seam that your seam allowance will be square with the side seam. And again, I just cut off that, I had some writing on here. It was 9 4/16. I'm going to just put it right here if I need to reference that later. And the H-bail that goes into the seam allowance, I'm going to just squiggles through that so it's not confused as a dart or a notch. And then we need to do the shoulder. So first thing is fold your pattern piece on the dart tip, close the dart going towards the armhole, tape it in place. We'll add seam allowance to this, and again this will just be a straight line going all the way across. And while this back dart at the shoulder is closed, let's go ahead and just take a second to make sure that the front shoulder notch matches perfectly with those two dart legs when they're closed. If it doesn't match, then change the notch here on the front piece. And then on the back piece here, come up to the dart tip and circle that a little bit darker so you always know where that is. Now here at the shoulder, once I open up that dart, you can see the shaping here in the shoulder, and it's a little tiny V, but make sure you keep that when you're cutting this out in the muslin fabric. So then also for these dart legs, you want to make sure that they go all the way through the seam allowance, because those are going to be notches for sewing. And then also make sure that you can clearly see the dart tip because it's circled. Now for these dart tips, we want to have a hole that's going all the way through our pattern piece. I'll show you two different ways that you can do this. If you're working at a design studio where they have a lot of different professional pattern making tools, you might find that they have what's called an awl. And what this does is this is going to punch a hole right into your pattern piece. We want to do it here at the dart tip. Now on your dart tip, if you don't have tape on there yet, go ahead and put a piece on there now. And then we're going to take this awl and we're going to push this right through the pattern piece so you can see it on both sides. And something that I like to do is I'll put another piece of tape here on the back, and I'll just push it all again through that piece of tape. Come over here to the back, and you can do this with me. So now I know you don't have an awl at home, so I'm going to show you another way how you could do this. So at the back waist dart tip, go ahead and put a piece of tape on there. Sharpen your pencil. And what you could do is you can poke this through, and what I have is my finger is right here on the back side of the paper. So basically what I'm doing is I'm poking this through right into my finger. And I want it to have a little bit of some size to it, so I'll kind of even push it through a little bit deep. And then basically the width of the pencil where the wood part is will make the hole a little bit larger. And then go ahead and flip it over, put a piece of tape on the back, and do the same thing coming back to the front. And then let's do the same thing up here for the shoulder dart. Now mine already has all kinds of tape all over it, so I'm going to just poke through from the front. And then I'll get this again from the back. Now since I have the awl tool, I'm going to go ahead and just get these nice and crisp with this tool. Now there's also another tool here for putting notches into your pattern pieces. So realistically, we would use this tool later on When you turn your paper into these oak tags, so it's a lot firmer and you're going to use these quite often, then you'll come in and you'll use your notcher to get all of your notches. On this thin pattern paper, you don't necessarily have to go in and use a notcher tool, and I'll show you how we're going to notch these once we start cutting these out in muslin fabric. So just double check all of your seam allowance. Make sure there's no lines going through into the seam allowance. And if there's anything you can't erase, just put squiggles on there so you don't confuse them to be notches. And go ahead and take a picture of this and submit this to me as part of your homework for completing this video. Alright, this looks good. I think we're ready now to prepare our muslin fabric to start cutting these out.